Margaret Tudor's life was one of political maneuvering, personal hardship, and tumultuous relationships, shaped by the volatile landscape of 16th century British and Scottish history. As the eldest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, she was born into a world where royal marriages were less about love and more about forging alliances. Her journey from a young princess betrothed to secure peace between England and Scotland to a queen navigating the perils of widowhood, regency, and betrayal was filled with challenges. Through her marriages, particularly her disastrous union with Archibald Douglas, Margaret's struggles embody the difficulties faced by women of power in an era dominated by men. Her story is one of resilience, defiance, and a relentless pursuit of control over her own destiny, despite the forces conspiring against her. Her life, however, was not just a personal saga, but a crucial chapter in British history. Margaret's legacy extended beyond her own reign, influencing the lineage of monarchs that followed. As the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-grandmother of James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England, her role in shaping the future of both nations cannot be overstated. The events surrounding her life and her controversial choices highlight the precarious nature of power, the limitations imposed on women in high positions, and the lengths to which she was willing to go to maintain authority and protect her lineage. Margaret Tudor's story is one of triumph and tragedy, filled with intrigue, romance, and a fight for survival in a world that sought to control her every move. Margaret Tudor took the Scottish Earl of Angus as her second husband, a union that devolved into a nightmare. He relinquished much of his influence and was ultimately compelled to flee back to England with the support of his brother, Henry VIII. However, upon his return a year later to be with her husband, he made a disturbing discovery. Margaret was the very first Tudor princess of England, born in 1489. He was the second child but the eldest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. At a time when royal baby boys were generally preferred to girls, Margaret's parents were actually pleased with their daughter, though for a less than noble reason. Margaret's father Henry didn't have a secure hold on power. He had claimed his throne by slaying the previous king, which meant that Henry couldn't convincingly assert his rule through divine right. His best strategy for maintaining his crown was to cultivate good relations with other European powers, and that meant having daughters to marry off to eligible bachelors. Prince Margaret grew up in the luxurious Eltham Palace with her younger siblings, the infamous Henry VIII, and her sister Mary, who would become the Queen of France. Royals often arranged marriages for literal children, and Margaret's family was no different. Before he was even 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to King James IV of Scotland, who was 22. Young Margaret's hand in marriage would ensure years of a treaty of perpetual peace between England and Scotland. Margaret's family and King James had been fighting for years, and now council members feared that marrying young Margaret to James IV could pave the way for the Scots to seize the English throne. When he was 12, Margaret and James were married via proxy ceremony, meaning he wasn't actually at the wedding, similar to when people can't be bothered to attend to receive their Oscar. Though Margaret remained in England for 2 more years, he was legally referred to as Queen of Scots. In 1503, when Margaret was only 14, his mother, Queen Elizabeth of York, gave birth to a child who lived only for a couple of days. And about a week later, Queen Elizabeth also died. In June, just months after losing his mother, Margaret followed his father's orders and headed off to Edinburgh. On August 8, 1503, Margaret capped off his roller coaster of a year with a royal wedding. He was charismatic, rich, and funny. James leaped directly onto his horse rather than using the stirrups, and to the joy of the Scottish people, he invited Margaret to squeeze onto his horse so that they could ride to Edinburgh together. Cute. During his marriage to King James, Margaret gave birth 6 painful times. Sadly, all the children except for one would die as infants. The only surviving child was a boy named James. On April 21, 1509, Margaret's father, King Henry VII, died at the age of 52 from tuberculosis. With Henry's demise, Margaret's life in the course of British history changed overnight. Margaret's younger brother, Henry VIII, ascended to the throne of England, and with his reign, the peace treaty between England and Scotland immediately began to break down. England began fighting with France, which was Scotland's longtime ally. It didn't take long for tensions to reach fever pitch. Soon enough, Margaret's husband and brother were on opposite sides of a vicious conflict. As Henry got ready to invade France, James got ready to invade England. Margaret, meanwhile, was dealing with his own problems. Henry was so mad that he sided with her husband that he threatened to disinherit his own sister from the throne. As James got ready to fight for Scotland, Margaret began to suffer from terrifying nightmares. According to legend, he dreamt of James falling from a great height. On September 9, 1513, Margaret Tudor sat in Linlithgow Palace and waited to hear about her husband's fate in the enormous, chaotic Battle of Flodden. Soon enough, Margaret's premonitions were confirmed in the worst way possible. Along with 10,000 Scots, his beloved James charged into the fray, only to be violently slain by the English forces. Margaret's sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, had James's bloody coat retrieved from Flodden and sent it to her husband, Henry VIII, as a love token. With her husband gone and the heir to the throne still in nappies, Margaret Tudor became the regent ruler of Scotland. He held power on behalf of little Prince James until he came of age. All this was clearly laid out in the deceased king's will. Unfortunately, the court deeply resisted Margaret's power. For one, people hesitated to let a woman rule, but Margaret was also awkwardly the sister of the guy who had indirectly killed King James in the first place. Margaret Tudor was one of the most influential women of her time. She was not only the Queen of Scotland, but also the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-grandmother of James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, uniting the two crowns. Margaret's second marriage to Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, was turbulent. She later sought to divorce him, which was a rare and scandalous move for a woman of her status in the early 16th century. Despite the political turmoil, Margaret played a key role in securing the future of the Scottish throne. Her negotiations and correspondence with her brother, Henry VIII, helped maintain a fragile peace between Scotland and England. She was also known for her strong-willed personality and ability to maneuver through the complex politics of the time. Margaret was an early advocate for her son James VI's rule, but her influence diminished after her third marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Methven, which further complicated her political position. She died in 1541 at the age of 51, largely forgotten by the English court but still respected in Scotland. Her legacy lived on through the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. It was through her lineage that James VI of Scotland eventually inherited the English throne, marking the beginning of the Stuart rule in England. This event, known as the Union of the Crowns in 1603, fulfilled Margaret's unintended but lasting impact on British history. During this eventful and horrible time in Margaret's life, he was also dealing with the discomfort and stress of being pregnant. In the spring after his husband's passing, Margaret went into labor and gave birth to the Scottish king's last son, Alexander. In between all the power grabs and personal tragedies, Margaret somehow found time to fall in love. Archibald Douglas was, according to his own family, a young, witless fool, and apparently Margaret couldn't get enough of him. In August 1514, he eloped with this fool, and soon enough, all hell broke loose. It turned out that Archibald Douglas had been grooming Margaret from the very beginning. When he married her, he was already engaged to another woman. In fact, by some accounts, he might have already been married. Queen Margaret did not have a peaceful exit from the throne. After marrying Douglas, the Scottish court turned on her and demanded that she give up his crown and let the Duke of Albany govern the country. This was already an insult, but for Margaret, the real kicker was that the court insisted she'd leave her sons, James and Alexander, with them. Feeling like he was backed into a corner, Margaret handed over his children to the new governor of Scotland. Soon after, he decided to leave Scotland entirely to get away from the country's watchful eyes. Margaret appealed to an unlikely savior, her brother Henry. Henry helped Margaret flee from Scotland and escape the wrath of the new ruler, the Duke of Albany. However, he didn't necessarily do it out of the kindness of his heart. Henry had to keep Margaret happy because at this time he was his heir. To add to Margaret's stress, he was carrying her second husband's child as he fled Scotland. Of course, he didn't stick around to support her through the birth, and instead he stayed in Scotland to make nice with the new ruler. He publicly accused the Duke of Albany of poisoning her baby son. Margaret spent much of 1516 traveling, only for his days in the sun to grind to a halt. After all, Henry always had his eye on the prize to gain power in Scotland. He needed Margaret there, influencing her son, the future king, to play nice with England. By 1517, he was back in Scotland and about to have his life turned upside down. Her second husband, Douglas, had shacked up with an old mistress, and the pair were living a lavish lifestyle. A lifestyle he was charging to Margaret's purse. Upon discovering her second husband's adultery, Margaret immediately got to work on divorcing him, but this was back in the 1500s, so that was going to take a long time. By 1521, when Margaret and Douglas were in a scorched earth breakup, while Margaret was doing everything he could to divorce him, Douglas was busy controlling her money, barring her from his lands, and keeping her from acting in her son's court. To make matters worse, in the last few years, Douglas and his allies had seized control of the Scottish government, meaning that he was not an easy guy to dump. Luckily for Margaret, he had a clever trick up his sleeve. When Douglas and his men took over the government, they booted out the Duke of Albany. Back in the day, Albany and Margaret were enemies, but now the two joined forces. In November of 1521, Margaret successfully waged a coup against her own husband. He was humiliatingly booted from power and relieved of all his government titles. Douglas could only watch as his wife marched victoriously into Edinburgh, side by side with their once mutual enemy, the Duke of Albany. To some people, Margaret reconciled a little too well with her ex-rival. Rumors swirled that the Queen of Scots was having an affair with her new ally. But he was dealing with far more than just an unpopular romance. He soon learned that he'd let an honest-to-God spy into his household too. When it looked like angry Scottish nobles were going to make both Isabella and her convent pay the price, Queen Margaret actually stepped in to get mercy for her. In return, Margaret told Hopringle that he had to stop spying and be loyal only to Margaret. He returned the favor by continuing to spy for the English. As Isabella's spying might have suggested, England and Scotland were back to hating each other. For years, they'd get into fights, nearly start a war, then retreat once freaked-out courtiers sent enough diplomatic letters. Everyone double-crossed everyone else until the dust settled, and Margaret's son, King James III, finally took the throne in 1524. But even with her son wearing the crown, Margaret still had his own battles to fight. First, one on the chopping block, her awful estranged husband, Archibald Douglas. Even though Henry VIII wanted Margaret and Douglas to reunite, he was still desperate for a divorce. Over the last few years, he'd ousted Douglas from power, got him exiled to 2 different countries, and even threatened to start a war before letting him back into Scotland. It was fairly obvious that he was over him, but Henry VIII didn't exactly take no for an answer. He invited Douglas to come on over and woo his sister back. After point-blank refusing to reconcile with Douglas, Margaret's power-hungry estranged husband lashed out. He and his men marched on the Scottish Parliament and attempted to seize control from Margaret and her son King James. Margaret wrote to her old ally, the Duke of Albany, and explicitly said that he'd team up with him and fight England before he'd take Douglas back. Unfortunately, this letter was intercepted by the worst possible person, her brother Henry I. He gave her such a dressing down that he fearfully took back his words and began to play nice with Douglas. When Douglas got even an inch of power, he did his best to use it for all it was worth. For example, when he was given guardianship over the 14-year-old King James in 1526, he used the opportunity to try to turn the boy against Margaret and her brother King Henry. Douglas all but kidnapped the boy, refusing to let him go back to his mother. Margaret desperately tried to rescue her son, but none of her attempts were successful. In the end, the boy king had to escape all by himself after 3 long years in his deranged stepfather's house. When he finally reunited with Margaret, James was stunned. A lot had happened to his mother in the years that he'd been away. For one, Margaret had a new lover and the Scottish nobleman Henry Stuart. Beginning in 1524, the Queen lavished her beau with fancy appointments and titles, all of which ticked off the senior nobility. Soon enough, Margaret began to share a home with her new boyfriend, now fancily titled Lord Methven. Margaret, who used to be a constant member of the Scottish court, barely attended Parliament anymore, and people whispered that it was because he was concealing an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. At this point, Margaret needed a divorce like never before. He felt he had no choice but to use his trump card. For once, Douglas's endless womanizing actually worked in Margaret's favor. He got his much-wished-for divorce thanks to the fact that when he and Douglas tied the knot, he was already engaged to another woman. With that, Queen Margaret Tudor was finally free. So what did he do? Obviously, he immediately married another awful man. Just 1 year after his divorce, Margaret married Lord Methven. Unfortunately, he turned out to be even more adulterous and wasteful than her second husband. He shacked up with a mistress of his own, and just like Douglas, he and his lover lived on Margaret's dime. This is a huge part of why 10 years after their wedding bells rung, Margaret was petitioning for another divorce. After June 1528, James V began to rule for himself, but Margaret held no role in her son's government. In fact, mother and son didn't seem to get along when forced to interact directly. James had ticked off Margaret by refusing to let her divorce another husband. Margaret also complained about a lack of money given to her by the king. In actuality, their relationship fell apart firmly because of one person, Margaret. He had been caught spilling his son's state secrets to his rival, King Henry VIII. All in all, Margaret wasn't the best mother, the greatest judge of character, or the most savvy ruler. Over his later years, he annoyed enough people, including his powerful brother and son, that his influence dwindled away. Even though he and James made up later in life, they didn't have many happy years together. Shortly after a stroke, Margaret Tudor died on October 18, 1541, at the age of 51. Even though Margaret had sent for her son James, he didn't get to his mother's bedside quickly enough. Sadly, he breathed his last breath without him by her side. Margaret Tudor has a significant legacy. After all, he may have been the one who introduced King Henry to the idea of divorce. When Henry heard that his big sister would dare to treat the sacrament of marriage so lightly, he was absolutely aghast. He also once said it was impossible for anyone to live a more shameful life than Margaret. After a lifetime of fighting and making up, Queen Margaret Tudor of Scotland kind of got the last laugh over her infamous brother. Her descendants are the ones who sit on the throne today, not Henry's. Henry VIII died without grandchildren, but Margaret was grandmother to Mary, Queen of Scots, and thus great-grandmother to James I, who succeeded Elizabeth I on the English throne. Therefore, today's British royal family owes their claim via dignified descent from the scandalous Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor's life was a testament to the challenges of royal duty, the dangers of political alliances, and the sacrifices demanded of women in power. Her journey from a young girl used as a political pawn to a queen fighting for control over her own fate reflects the complexities of ruling in an era where gender dictated influence. While she may not have been the most adept strategist or the most politically astute ruler, her relentless determination to secure her place in history and protect her descendants was undeniable. Her troubled marriages, her struggles as a mother, and her political miscalculations ultimately led to her diminished influence, but they also cemented her role as a key figure in the dynastic struggles of England and Scotland. Her choices, whether wise or reckless, set the stage for future conflicts and shaped the lineage of British royalty. Margaret Tudor may not have lived to see the full extent of her legacy, but her bloodline would eventually unite the crowns of England and Scotland, a testament to the enduring impact of her life's turbulent journey. In the annals of history, she remains a figure of intrigue, a woman who defied expectations, suffered greatly, and yet left an indelible mark on the royal landscape of Britain.